I'm Julia Manchester, and welcome to What's America Thinking. We're diving into some of the biggest issues facing this country. We know you're frustrated and fed up with government and its inability to make your lives better and understand your struggles. So let's dive right into the disconnect between Washington and the people. The economy has been the #1 concern for people across this nation. But wake up, Washington, because this week, immigration has taken the lead, becoming the top issue for Americans, and they are making that loud and clear.
It's a little wild right now. I'm all for everybody coming over here to, make a different life. I just wish it was a little bit more controlled.
There's too many people that are coming from everywhere now. Very, very dangerous to be illegal. So thankfully, I can legal.
I absolutely do not see a problem with letting people come to our country. However, they have to assimilate. In Houston, Texas, there are areas that are flying the flags of other countries. No, absolutely not.
Immigrants have the right to be here. This land does not belong to the people that are in power. There is actually indigenous land.
I think it's important that we allow immigration because I don't think that we have enough people in this country to keep the economy going like it is, and I'm all for it.
With months of contentious negotiations and mixed messages, the Republicans persistently blast Biden's policies on the topic, while Democrats blame the GOP for blocking immigration reform.
They're destroying the blood of our country. That's what they're doing. They're destroying our country.
I don't believe, as the former president said again yesterday, that immigrants are polluting our blood.
The administration has done next to nothing to protect the border, but we've all seen with our own eyes they have opened the border wide to the entire world.
And for over 2 months, Democrats have shown we are serious about reaching an agreement by remaining at the negotiating table.
We must insist that the border be the top priority.
It's time to wake up, Washington. Here to make sense of all of the fighting and finger pointing is Rafael Bernal, who covers the Hispanic political world and policy issues revolving around immigration. Rafael, it's so good to see you, friend.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Yeah, so to start off with, there's a new Harvard-Harris poll that found immigration surpassed inflation as the #1 issue for Americans, increasing 7 points since last month to 35%. How did we get here?
Well, there's two sides to this, right? The first side is inflation isn't that big of a problem anymore. Inflation isn't down where the Fed wants it, but it's pretty close, and it's way down from the 9.1 we saw in June of 22. But immigration is in the news every day, and those images from the border, the chaos at the border, the Department of Homeland Security's inability to manage, a migration phenomenon that we haven't seen, that we've never seen. This is a completely new situation, and the federal government, it's just not equipped to deal with it.
It's so interesting because I was on the road in Iowa and New Hampshire, and I would talk to voters in 2 states that are thousands of miles away from the southern border, and immigration was their top priority when asked, what's your top priority when you go to the ballot box? But, I want to go to another CBS News poll that found that 45% of Americans view the situation as a crisis, and 30% think it's a serious problem. How has this trend changed over the past decade, and what have been the key contributing factors to those changes?
Well, that's a key word. There's been a lot of fighting in D.C. over whether it's a crisis or not. Beauty's in the eye of the beholder on this one. But what has changed is the demographic of who's coming. 10 years ago, you started seeing people from Central America, not just Mexico, crossing the border. That's when you had the unaccompanied minor crisis. That was really tough for Obama to handle. And then in those past 10 years, you've extended from Central America into large parts of South America, especially Venezuela, for instance, a country that, with a unproductive government, to put it mildly. They've expelled about 10 million people. They're not all here, but a lot of them are on their way here or already here. So the demographics changed, the volume changed, and what didn't change was the strategy to deal with it. And there's been some changes. The Trump administration tried some things that they want to bring back. The Republicans really want to bring back. It's not clear whether they worked. It's very clear that immigration dropped during the Trump administration in 2020, but everything froze during the pandemic. So you can't really attribute Trump policies to that drop. And the Biden administration has been trying to make it easier to come, but it's really hard to change immigration policy without changing immigration law.
It is really hard. And going back to 2020, it feels like we've lived a lifetime in those 4 years alone. But a recent Gallup poll showed that 2020 was the peak of pro-immigration sentiment. But that dropped drastically in the years following. You touched on this a bit in your last answer, but what happened in those 4 years?
So pro and anti-immigration sentiment in this country, since it's been tracked for the last 60 or 70 years, it's tracked a lot with the political mood of this country. So from the mid-90s onward, when people started encountering more immigrants in their communities, because that first sort of wave of Mexican immigration sort of settled here, sentiment actually went up. People started liking immigrants more because they weren't as scary, something scary that they've never met. They were actual human beings. In 9/11, right after 9/11, obviously, the pro-immigrant sentiment dropped. People were afraid. What happened throughout the Trump years, say from 2015 when he first started running for president, is one side started saying immigrants are good, the other side started saying immigrants are bad, but by 2020, when Biden won the presidency, the politics of that campaign drove immigrant sentiment up. The chaos at the border since then has driven pro-immigrant sentiment down.
And, speaking of campaigns, Trump is by and large the front runner in the Republican nominating contest, and he is in many ways seen as the de facto leader of the Republican Party. He's been inserting himself into congressional negotiations over funding for border security. What's he saying, and what does the GOP really ultimately want in the end game here?
Well, we didn't know that until this week, and our colleagues who cover the Senate have done an excellent job on reporting this. Republican senators are saying that Trump is telling them not to pass a deal because he wants the border as an issue for the upcoming election.
Right.
And that is, everybody suspected that was the case. It's not the first, it's not the first we hear of this, but nobody had said that out loud. And the strange thing is, a lot of immigration advocates and experts think that this deal would have generated more chaos at the border. So given Trump what he wanted, presumably, if you believe these senators, and if he does tank this deal, he doesn't Biden doesn't get a win, doesn't get to sign a border, but that's about it. Biden doesn't also have to fight his left flank, getting rid of asylum, for instance, or severely curtailing asylum. So he might be doing Biden a favor here.
It's so interesting, and I want to go back to a point you just made. You talked about immigration experts saying that a deal could result in more chaos at the border. If you could quickly explain that, that seems kind of counterintuitive.
It's the history of immigration legislating in this country.
Yeah.
Every time over the past 30 years that Congress has legislated on the border, it's been against a deadline or trying to send a message before an election, just basically not the way good policy is built. And every time those laws have created more chaos at the border because they simply aren't good policy.
Right.
And it seems like the Senate was falling into that same trap. We don't know exactly because we haven't seen the text of what's been negotiated, but what has come out of that room, what we have heard about, that it sounds to be following the same pattern.
Right. And, staying on the Senate, a group of bipartisan senators, Chris Murphy from Connecticut, Lindsey Graham, South Carolina, Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, they're negotiating the border deal. But if you look at that group, there's obviously a lack of Hispanic representation in that group. And this is an issue that very much involves Hispanic and Latino Americans. Why have they not been invited to the negotiating table?
Well, I wish we knew why, and they're not saying. They're keeping that to themselves. The message that is sending is basically that Latinos or the Hispanic caucus or senators with big immigrant populations or senators who are immigrants. I mean, they're not all Latino. Mazie Hirono was born in Japan.
Yeah.
That they're too emotionally connected to this issue. You know, basically the message that is sending is that they won't be able to negotiate the hard parts, which is obviously not the message that Democrats want to send to voters of color ahead of an election. But until they say why they chose who they chose, and you know, the people in the room they are policy experts in parts of immigration. You know, Chris Murphy chairs appropriations for Homeland Security, so he knows how that budget works. Langford's in that as well. Kirsten Sinema is a chair of another subcommittee dealing with the border, so they know that stuff. But they don't have the lived experience, and that is really getting a lot of criticism against, especially against Schumer and Biden.
The lived experience, and this is so important, whether you're an immigrant from Latin America, you know, or other parts of the world. It's definitely something to watch out for and talk about. Rafael Bernal, thank you so much for joining us today.
Hey, great to join you.